Anna Freud was the unplanned, unwanted sixth child of Sigmund and Martha Freud. Anna said later that if any acceptable safe means of contraception had been available to her parents, she would not have been born. In fact, Sigmund Freud considered prophylactics to be unhealthy, psychologically and physically. The only form of birth control that he advocated was abstinence, which he and Martha practiced with commitment after Anna's birth. Both of Anna's parents were in ill health. Martha was exhausted by her many pregnancies. And Sigmund suffered chest pains and believed he was about to die. He smoked 20 cigars a day and tried to give up the habit, treating himself with cocaine, a remedy he generally prescribed to patients for physical ailments, depression, and as a cure for morphine addiction. Martha did not nurse Anna, nor did she hire a wet nurse as was customary. Anna was bottle-fed to commercial formula by Josephine Scherlaus, a Catholic nurse.
A lot of things go on around feeding, a lot of bonding, eye contact, interaction, parent and child, and that's part of why parents who are holding their kids, whether it be bottle feeding or breastfeeding, it becomes a very special moment of bonding and interaction with the mother and the child. And so Anna didn't get to experience that.
Anna Freud was born into a Jewish family in Vienna, the most anti-Semitic city in Europe. Austrian newspapers carried stories about the Masters of Zion and the blood libel.
Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a book exposed numerous times as a complete fabrication, but it first appeared in Europe in the 19th century. It's all about how the Jews are going to take over the world, or have taken over the world. Initially, it was thought that Jews were not human, and it was the consumption of the blood of a human, of a non-Jewish child, would keep them human and keep them in human form. That is the ancient, more pagan side of the blood libel. Even though we understand now that a religion is simply something that you practice, back then they believed that it was a much deeper thing, and that it determined physical characteristics and how a person thought and acted.
Sigmund Freud made every attempt to appear bourgeois in dress and demeanor, and resented the Ostjuden for calling attention to themselves as Jews.
The residents of Vienna, they felt superior to those Jews that were coming from elsewhere, were coming from Eastern Europe. There was difference in language, there was difference in style of dress, there was difference in behavior, levels of sophistication.
Martha Freud's grandfather was a rabbi of Orthodox Judaism, and although Sigmund Freud declared himself an atheist, he sent his children to Hebrew school.
You could be an atheist and still enjoy culturally Jewish things, and still maybe attend a Seder on Passover. You could still hang out with your Jewish relatives.
Vienna was a multicultural, cosmopolitan city, the intellectual center of the Catholic universe. National boundaries were loose within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and with the recession of the late 19th century, people flocked to Vienna looking for work. Acclamation of so many cultures fostered the openness and the bohemian lifestyle that allowed for the free thinking so necessary for the development of psychoanalysis. The opera was open 7 nights a week. Artists painted on the street. Even Adolf Hitler was drawn to Vienna as a young man to study painting. Vienna was a city of the psychologically disturbed. The suicide rate was the highest in Europe. Sigmund Freud's first book, Studies on Hysteria, written in collaboration with Dr. Breuer, was published a few months before Anna's birth. The genesis of the book was the famous case study of Anna O. The book purported that Anna O, diagnosed with hysterical paralysis and hallucination, had been cured through a process of hypnosis and regression therapy, which was not true. Because Breuer also prescribed morphine, Anna O became a drug addict and was institutionalized repeatedly. The importance of Anna O's case was that it started the talking cure for mental illness and the psychoanalytic movement. It brought attention to Freud, and most importantly, it brought him patients who helped him support his large family, as well as the cook, the maid, the charwoman, governess, and nanny. When Anna was a year old, her mother's unmarried sister, Minna Burnett, came to live with the family. When she arrived at 19 Vergas, the matriarchal roles were divided. Martha took control of the household, Minna took control of Sigmund Freud, acting as secretary and travel companion. While Minna shared Sigmund's ideas, Martha avoided them.
Wenn mir nicht klar wäre, wie ernst mein Mann seine Untersuchungen nimmt, dann würde ich glauben, seine Psychoanalyse ist eine Art von Pornografie.
Anna's widowed grandmother, Amalie Freud, lived in Vienna with her unmarried daughters and dined at Freud household every Sunday evening. Surrounded by family and hired care, Anna's recollections of her childhood were not happy. She felt herself an unwelcome nuisance to her older siblings, abandoned and pressured by her parents. Anna's second year of life involved a strict regimen of toilet training. Because of her poor progress, she was punished. She particularly remembered being left behind when her siblings went to the circus.
Feeling pressure to be toilet trained at too young of an age, according to Freud, would result in children having problems with control, problems with letting go and holding on. One of the few things that kids have at that age is they have a will to control their own bodies. And encouraging them to toilet train too young or putting any kind of pressure will actually be, in essence, asking them to relinquish their will.
Her aggression was overt. Once, when her oldest sister Matilda had eaten all the apples, Anna demanded that her belly be split open to retrieve them.
Anna is turning into a charming child.
All of the children lisped, as their father had as a child. Matilda, the oldest and considered the good-natured and reasonable one in the family, was in ill health most of her life. Martin, who felt mistreated by his mother, was protective of his sisters. Oliver was Sigmund's favorite child, until he displayed symptoms of obsessional neurosis. Ernst, the most independent of the boys, was called the lucky child by Sigmund and Martha. And Sophie, their mother's favorite and Anna's rival. Sophie was, by family agreement, the beautiful daughter. Their father postulated that their lisping was a displacement of conflict over anal functioning. When she was 6, Anna began attending an elite private school. Outside of school, the Jewish and Gentile children did not mix socially.
Children develop stereotypes about all kinds of groups very early. So you can see children show prejudice against people based on their weight and their attractiveness and their physical handicap or not status. So children would have developed stereotypes about Jews and Gentiles very early. Her peers then would have been aware of her group membership, and she would have been aware of the wider society's views of Jews.
Anna resented the rote learning and drill work. She preferred realistic stories as opposed to fantasy, choosing to identify with the male heroes in Rudyard Kipling stories over the princesses in Grimm's fairy tales.
Certainly by the age of 4 and 5, children attribute the male role with more power and more status than the female role. Boys do this as well as girls. So girls develop through most of their childhood with an idea that girls are not as important or powerful as men.
During Anna's childhood, her father's theories were considered scandalous, and he was considered a crackpot. His essays postulated that everyone was bisexual, and that many people practiced bestiality. Polite society did not acknowledge sexuality at all, yet prostitution was licensed in Vienna. The cost of a prostitute's service was the same as the cost of a newspaper. Upper-class families hired clean country girls as maids to sexually service their sons. Sigmund Freud's open declaration that sexual repression was the basis of neurosis was astonishing and courageous. He also advocated sexual enjoyment for women, blaming a husband's sexual inadequacy for the neurosis in his wife. a radical theory in a society that discouraged women from admitting any sexual desire.
Freud is encouraging women privately to fulfill themselves sexually, on the one hand, and on the other hand, he is trying to heal them by asking of them to accept the status quo and repressed sexuality in Victorian society.
The professional world in Vienna operated on a patronage system, a form of mentoring in which men seeking employment were given introductions and letters of referral. This system was unavailable to Jewish men, particularly those with strange theories. With the help of rich friends and some exchange of favors, Sigmund Freud was granted a professorship in 1902. Along with his legitimacy, he started the Wednesday Society, inviting 4 Jewish doctors to meet in his library to discuss his work. Anna joined her mother, Aunt Minna, and her sisters in the family knitting circle. When Sophie declared that Anna was no good at knitting, Anna became obsessed with proving otherwise. Her parents attempted to moderate her compulsiveness, and she took up weaving. Her father interpreted this as Anna's unconscious motivation to weave a cover for her genital deficiency. Anna's personal introduction to psychoanalysis came at age 13 when she was taking a walk with her father and he told her,
You see those houses with their lovely facades? Things are not necessarily so lovely behind those facades. And so it is with human beings also.
Anna was then allowed to begin attending the Wednesday meetings, now called the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, listening to the men discuss their sexual theories and their patients.
I think there could be some sense of having her own boundaries violated, her own sexual boundaries, and worrying about letting people into her life in that way, maybe having to construct more rigid boundaries.
During her years in Lyceum, Anna was thin and stooped and caused her parents concern because of her lack of normal femininity and because of her constant quarrels with Sophie.
So it produces kind of a crisis in thinking about gender and the role in society. Of course, you also have the onset of the expectations of dating and sexual activity, and again, to the extent that that's connected to a gender role, the role that one would fulfill in dating boys, there would be another crisis and problem. And what we see in some girls is a desire to prevent that from happening, to prevent the onset of these new roles with this a crisis. So that one strategy might be to try not to develop breasts, to try not to put on the weight that would be associated with becoming rounder and hippier and looking more like a potential dating partner. And being very thin is one way to do that.
She was competitive, wanting to be better than the other girls, better than her friends Marianne Rye and Annie Rosenberg. Anna took the role of the brainy daughter in the Freud family, whose value system prescribed marriage as the source of female fulfillment, not education. These were the years that her father postulated his theory that penis envy was profound in shaping a woman's character. As the possession of a penis gave entry into a career, political status, the freedom to enter a restaurant alone, many women would definitely envy the owners of such an organ. Because her relationship with her own mother was strained, during her adolescence and young adulthood, Anna attached herself to several older women who served as substitute mothers. The first was Loie Kahn, who arrived for analysis with Sigmund Freud in 1912, suffering from morphine addiction and a troubled relationship with Ernest Jones, a British psychoanalyst who had a tendency towards sexual scandal. A second substitute mother, Lou Andreas Salome, was a romantic adventuress who had affairs with Leon Trotsky, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Anna's favorite poet, Rainer Maria Rilke. Her sexuality threatened Sigmund Freud and attracted him. Lou, a trained psychoanalyst, was Anna's closest and most admired mother substitute. When Anna graduated from Lyceum in 1912, she was taken on a tour of Italy. Shortly after Anna left, Sophie announced her engagement. Plans were made for a wedding to which Anna was not invited. Anna would stay alone in Italy for the winter while the rest of the family attended the wedding. When Anna wrote to her father about her distress at not being invited to the wedding, he replied that she was experiencing negative Oedipal feelings because Sophie's fiancé had been able to win Sophie's love easily when Anna never had.
It's a form of rejection in a way, because, I mean, her parents went to the wedding, so it wasn't just being rejected by her sister, it's being rejected by the whole family. And the people who didn't protest having her uninvited. And in that way, she has to relive being rejected and unwanted and unloved.
Anna's stay in Italy was apparently for recuperative as well as emotional reasons. She wrote her father of her weight gains. He wrote her that he hoped her stay in Italy would influence her out of obsessional behavior and toward normal feminine pleasures. She used her time in Italy to begin reading her father's books. Her emotional injuries were soothed when her father came personally to fetch her home. From that point onward, she was Sigmund Freud's traveling companion. In 1914, Anna passed the exam that would allow her to begin apprenticeship at the Cottage Lyceum. She was not encouraged to attend medical school, as did her friends Annie Rosenberg and Marianne Rye. A few weeks later, she traveled to England to visit relatives of her father. She toured southern England with Loie Kahn, who had by then rejected Ernest Jones and married someone else. Ernest Jones was having an affair with Loie Kahn's maid. Regardless, he began courting Anna. Sigmund Freud wrote letters to both Ernest Jones and Anna, stating the unsuitableness of a marriage between them. The world was caught by surprise when Austria declared war on Serbia and England became Austria's enemy. Loie Kahn worked arduously to arrange for Anna to sail home with the Austrian ambassador. The friendship with Loie Kahn was terminated of the war. During the war, Anna taught second grade while her brothers Ernst and Martin served in the Austrian army. At first, the Freud family supported the war effort, but as it dragged out, the carnage became intolerable. 6,000 people a day were slaughtered for 1,500 days. Psychoanalytic clients stopped their treatment. Fuel shortages made it possible to heat only one room in the Freud home, and Anna worked on class preparations in her cold bedroom. All commodities were scarce. Anna was often hungry and malnourished. Facsimile meat was made from tree bark and meat jelly. Restaurants served horse meat when it was available. When the war ended, the Habsburg Empire was broken up and Austria was in financial ruin. German-speaking refugees poured into Vienna. The farm production of Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans was lost, so that food remained scarce. There was a homeless problem in Vienna, and 80,000 civil servants were laid off. Both Ernst and Martin returned home infected with tuberculosis, as did a large portion of the Austrian army. Sándor Ferenczi, a Hungarian psychoanalyst, arranged for the Freud family to spend the summer of 1917 in Hungary, where there was plenty of food and Anna could recuperate. By the end of World War I, Sigmund Freud had formed the Secret Committee, 7 men, including himself, that pledged themselves to psychoanalysis and each other. There was even a ring for each of them. They set up free psychoanalytic clinics to treat people who could not afford to pay, particularly soldiers suffering shell shock. In October 1918, Anna began analysis with her father. They met an hour a day for 6 days a week at 10 p.m., after Sigmund Freud had seen 13 other analysans.
It wasn't necessarily considered unusual for someone to analyze their own child. For instance, Carl Jung and Abraham and Melanie Klein all analyzed their own children. This was also, the fact that it would maybe be wise not to, was also something that was underappreciated for women. where it was thought to be more of a problem for a son to be in analysis, usually with one's father, and it was considered less of a problem for a girl to be in analysis with her father, and that was just part of the lack of understanding about women.
Anna was able to reveal her beating fantasies to her father, but kept to herself her need for praise and admiration.
The layers of the beating fantasy came up in, say, prototypically in analysis, the one that Freud reported on. The person would first have the idea that a child is being beaten, or an image in their mind they keep coming back to. Then later, after coming back to this over and over, and a great deal of work, the person would then begin to voice the idea that it's the child is being beaten, and it's being beaten, and it's actually the child might be like one of their siblings, being beaten by their father, with the idea that the father must love the person who's spinning out the fantasy the most, because obviously the father is beating and hates the other sibling. So the fantasy at that point is then the child's wish for their father's love, with the idea the father would then hate one of the other children. Now, this part was easier to get to. A very more deeply depressed aspect of the fantasy, which might come up after a great deal of work, of many months or even a year or two after that, was that the person who is telling the fantasy themselves is actually the one being beaten by the father, and it would be a substitute for the father's love.
Children have and come with a really desperate need for approval from their parents, as driven to have love and affection. And it may be such a basic drive that we often don't recognize it, that we don't recognize in ourselves that what we often are seeking so desperately is approval and affection just for who we are. Even if she did recognize that she had that need, it is very possible that she couldn't express it because she recognized that her father couldn't give it.
During her analysis, Anna began writing poetry.
Only when my mind was churned more deeply, when I was struggling with wild dark forces, did I, alone in my need, feel with fear that each poet sings but his own sorrow.
Her goals for her analysis were to rid herself of anxiety, obstinacy, and her masculinity complex. Her father's goals included coercing her to give up her compulsive masturbation, which would leave her sexually arid, as her father steered her away from all marriage prospects, and although he prescribed sexual freedom for other women, would never advocate an affair for his daughter.
Her father had a very liberal view of sexuality with regards to women compared to the views at the time, so he argued that women should enjoy sex and have some degree of what would be called sexual liberation. It's still the case that Anna would have been confronted with a world in which she knew her father's ideas were not the norm. That is, her peers, the rest of her wider social group and society would have given her the opposite message.
Some part of Anna's analysis surely was devoted to her troubled relationship with her sister Sophie, which was intensified by Sophie's untimely death in 1920 from influenza.
My wife is overwhelmed. Anna looks bad.
After Sophie's death, Anna became obsessed with time. Still identifying with male characters, she wrote,
Just like a boy who tries to catch a fish from a brook with his bare hands, I stand on the shore of time which flows by me. The hours run by me without leaving anything alive in them.
When her analysis was completed in 1922, Anna decided to become a psychoanalyst. Being a science of outsiders and eccentrics, it was easy for women to join the ranks.
Initially, there were no training institutes and no formalized curricula. So if someone was interested in training in psychoanalysis, one would read all the literature. Often one would seek out one's own personal analyst, and for either several months or several years. And then one would write up and present a paper to the Psychoanalytic Society.
Probably one of the reasons that Anna was so driven to go into child psychology was to come to terms with her own life. to try to come to terms with what happened to her during childhood, what happened during those early years. Her father had a very important and influential theory, which I think she adhered to some degree, and she wanted to know what happened to her. And she wanted to make it better for other kids.
Anna then traveled to Germany to investigate working with Max Eddington in Berlin. She also visited Lou Andreas Salome, who encouraged her to remain with her father in Vienna. Anna formed a group of her own with Siegfried Bernfeld, Willy Hofer, and August Acorn. They gathered at 19 Burgas to discuss child analysis and welfare. Acorn would secretly love Anna for years. Sigmund Freud was working on his structural theory of the id, ego, and superego.
You would have three primary structures of the mind. You have the ego, which is the person's conscious awareness of themselves, their sense of identity, the way they try to integrate everything about their life. You have what was unconscious inside of a person, usually associated with the instincts like sexual instincts and aggressive drives. You'd have the outside world, other friends, intimates, social situations. And then you also have the superego, which is a person's own sense of morality and guilt, their own ideals, their conscience, so to speak. And the ego essentially is the manager of the conflicts between all of these agencies.
In 1923, Sigmund Freud was diagnosed with cancer of the mouth and began a series of excruciating operations that removed a large portion of his palate and several teeth. A gold prosthesis replaced his palate, enabling him to speak and eat. The prosthesis was a constant torment that rubbed against his tissue and created blisters. He continued to smoke 20 cigars a day. That summer, Anna traveled with him to Rome for recuperation, but the journey was spoiled when Freud hemorrhaged from the mouth. Anna was of marrying age. She had some brief flirtations with young men, which her father discouraged. Anna's need for a life companion was filled when Dorothy Tiffany Burlingame brought her children to Vienna for analysis. Daughter of the glass designer Louis Comfort Tiffany, Dorothy was separated from her mentally unstable and violent husband. The women shared the commonalities of being the youngest and least wanted child in their families, and Anna became possessive about the Burlingame children. Dorothy rented an apartment above the Freuds at 19 Burgas. She and Anna began taking vacations together. Whenever they were away, Anna wrote to her father every day and sent a daily telegram. Sigmund Freud analyzed Dorothy, and she trained with him to become an analyst herself. On Anna's 29th birthday, she was invited to join the committee. Otto Rank defected to the United States after a quarrel with the other members over his book, The Trauma of Birth. Anna was asked to replace him. Within a year, Carl Abraham died of a prolonged illness. The committee was shrinking, but the psychoanalytic movement was growing. The same year that Anna was asked to join the committee, she was also asked to become secretary of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society and teach at the newly formed Psychoanalytic Institute for Training. From her lectures, Anna developed a training manual for the institute, Introduction to the Technique of Child Analysis, which was published in 1927. It met with criticism from her former suitor Ernest Jones and Melanie Klein, a child psychoanalyst.
Well, both Melanie Klein and Anna Freud were pioneers in terms of child analysis and child therapy. Melanie, one of the differences in the understanding of aggression, Melanie Klein took Freud's idea of the death instinct, which very few other people did, and she located aggression as being an overwhelming force that was innate to the child and starts very, very young. And it makes any other sources of aggression irrelevant, particularly minimizes the child's relationship with their parents and other important people. Anna Freud, while certainly endorsing the drive theory of aggression, Also was very interested in the child's relations with their parents and important people, and in trying to relate any aggression or angry feelings that the child might have to their actual experiences and fantasies. Jones, who established psychoanalysis in England, endorsed Melanie Klein, and then the British Society sort of took up Melanie Klein and Melanie Klein's ideas. And there was a discounting in England of Anna Freud's ideas.
In the 1920s, there was a brief economic recovery in Austria. Then the Great Depression. Viennese banks crashed and unemployment was at 33%. In 1933, Engelbert Dollfuss became chancellor, and with Mussolini's influence turned Austria into an authoritarian corporate state, fervently Catholic, fervently anti-socialist, and fervently anti-Semitic. Austria engaged in a civil war. This unrest was the weakness that allowed the Nazis to infiltrate Austria. Dollfuss was shot and the Nazis were established. When Hitler became chancellor, German psychoanalysts began emigrating. When the Nuremberg laws were passed, Freud's books were burned and Max Eddington moved to Palestine.
The Jews had been assimilating into European culture, into European businesses and European positions. They felt like they belonged. They didn't believe it. They thought that this sort of thing couldn't happen. It wasn't going to last. Their non-Jewish neighbors and colleagues would stand up for them.
Anna channeled her anxiety into the formation of a Hort school that provided extended daycare for working-class families. At the Hort school, she conducted her famous eating experiment, allowing the children to eat whatever they wished and finding that within several weeks, all the children were eating a balanced diet. Shortly after the Hort school was opened, Dorothy Burlingame was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Her case was so severe that she left Vienna for a Swiss sanatorium, and her children left for America. The following year, Sigmund Freud's cancer returned. Twice a year until his death, he endured excruciating operations to remove tissue. He lived in pain. Along with her patients and the school, Anna took over caring for him.
Anna is the only one who can clean my prosthesis properly.
Anna began working on her second book, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense. She listed 10 mechanisms for ego defense and postulated one new one, identification with the aggressor.
In part, I think it relates to this position she's in of being invited into certain special realms, high status kinds of groups that are enough to make you feel grateful to be there and a part of something, to begin to identify with the group, begin to identify with the profession of, yes, I'm finally admitted into this group. This is something that I can do, I feel good about, I'm intellectually challenged by, and at the same time never having the full status and recognition of your abilities, so that in some sense the group is still the aggressor, the father is still the aggressor, you're still being judged unfairly, and therefore that is an aggressive action not to see you as capable as you know you are.
The book was published by Leonard and Virginia Woolf, and Anna gave it to her father for his 80th birthday. On March 12, 1937, the German army crossed the Austrian border and entered Vienna to a cheering crowd. Sigmund Freud stopped seeing patients, and the Psychoanalytic Society met for the last time. A committee of Nazis visited 19-Brugas and confiscated 5,000 shillings from the office safe. Martha remained calm, inviting them to put their rifles in the umbrella stand. Freud contacted Ernest Jones in England for help in getting emigration visas for his family. In general, middle-class Jews were turned away. Those with money or those in servitude were allowed visas to Britain. Many professionals claimed to be servants when applying for visas. Many others committed suicide.
The problem that those Jews who wanted to leave Germany and Austria came up against were immigration quotas in the countries that they wanted to go to.
Anna was picked up by the Gestapo and taken away for hours. Freud paced his office until she returned. Then he wept. Martin Freud procured Veronal capsules for the family so that they might all commit suicide in the event of an arrest. Feeling overwhelmed, Anna asked her father,
Why don't we just commit suicide?
Why should we? Because they want us to?
Before the Freuds could leave, they endured a dreadful period of waiting for their assets to be taxed by the Central Office of Jewish Immigration that was headed by Adolf Eichmann. Once the tax was paid, Sigmund Freud had to sign a statement that the Nazis had treated him with respect and consideration. He signed it and later remarked to Martin,
Yes, I can hardly recommend the Gestapo to anyone.
Freud's sisters remained behind in Vienna. They were in their 70s, and no one believed they were any kind of threat to the Nazis. By the time Great Britain was preparing for war on Germany in 1939, Sigmund Freud was dying. His cancer had become inoperable, and the decay in his jaw gave off a foul odor and attracted flies. Unable to bear the pain any longer, he asked his physician Max Schur to inject him with an overdose of morphine. He lapsed into a coma and died on September 23, 1939.
I miss the daily contact with him, the interchange of thought, the need he had for me apart from all the need I had for him. I dream that he's here again. All of these recent dreams have the same character. The main role is played not by my longing for him, but rather his longing for me, his tenderness to me, which in reality he never showed, with the exception of 1 or 2 times, which always remained in my memory. I think he thought we should have learned enough by now to manage alone.
On September 29th, Great Britain declared war against Germany. Because the men were drafted into the military, women took over the civilian jobs they vacated, as well as farm production. Anna and Dorothy Burlingame responded by forming the Hampstead War Nursery, which provided residential care for children of working parents, orphans, and children who had been bombed out of their homes. Children slept in air raid shelters in the basement so as not to disturb their sleep in event of night bombings. Parents were encouraged to live with their children or visit as often as possible, and Anna maintained a massive correspondence with the absent mothers and fathers overseas. Anna charted the eating, sleeping, and play patterns of the children and learned firsthand about the effects of separation trauma, foster care, sibling relationships with foster children, and the importance of mothering. Throughout the war, Anna conducted Wednesday seminars on psychoanalytic theory as her father had in Vienna. 20 young women worked for paltry wages at the nursery in order to obtain this training, including Sophie and Gertrude Dan, who would remain working with Anna after the war.
On May 7, 1945, there came at last an end to the war, which for almost 6 harsh years had conditioned the lives and the aims of the British people.
All 4 of Freud's sisters died in concentration camps. When Anna was questioned about the incomprehensibility of the Nazis arresting 4 70-year-old women, she said,
They wanted their apartments.
The same quotas existed after World War II as before. So not everybody from the displaced persons camp concentration camp survivors. Not everybody could get into the country that they wanted to go to, and then there was also the matter of funds, of being able to afford it. I know that my father's a survivor of the Holocaust. When he and some of his surviving brothers went back to their hometown, there was somebody living in their home. It wasn't theirs anymore, and they couldn't take possession of it to sell it. They had left valuables with neighbors who they trusted, and those neighbors, those people looked at them and just said, "We don't know you."
Anna's first post-war project was an experimenting group upbringing, a group of orphans from the Theresienstadt concentration camp who had been raised together since infancy were sent to the clinic at Bulldog's Bank.
Well, you had 6 children who were all taken away from their mothers anywhere from birth up through the first months of life, and they were then interred in a concentration camp where they lived for a full 3 years. And they weren't rescued from the concentration camp until they were in their 4th year. And any mothering that they had would have not been from a consistent person, and it would have been within the terrible environment of a concentration camp itself, where they were starved, deprived. Well, of course, it was horrible. Of course, the amazing thing is, while such horribly traumatized, deprived children, their development had actually, in many respects, been able to follow a normal course. For instance, they were able to learn English quite readily. Their intellectual capacity was normal for the most part. There were many of the things that you would want any child to learn how to do that they were able to do themselves. And the other interesting thing about them is that the mothering function, while they were actually hostile to anybody coming in to try to offer them mothering directly, mothering seemed to belong to the group as a whole, where the children essentially belonged to, as much as any young child might feel that they belong to their mother, the children felt that they belonged to the group. And the children in the group might take over different functions, different mothering functions at different time in a rather fluid manner. Now, at times this would begin to break down. For instance, interestingly with spoons, when it came time to eat and the children would all get their spoon, then chaos would happen. You'd have all kinds of rage, fights. They'd be fighting each other. It'd be chaos. What's so interesting about that is it has maybe a little bit less to do with food itself than it has to do with the spoon. See, when you're in a concentration camp, the one individual possession the children had was a spoon, as if the spoon stood in for all the individual possession that a child might have. Of course, the most precious individual possession a young child usually has is their parents. Well, these children had a spoon.
Anna's next branch of research was in the area of homosexuality. Both she and her father believed that homosexuality was a variation of sexual functioning based on arrested development. They differed in diagnosis. Sigmund felt that homosexuality did not require treatment. However, perhaps because it was illegal in England, Anna felt that it did.
Well, Freud didn't regard homosexuality as an illness. What he did regard it as is a arrest in sexual development. And at the time, it was quite innovative to actually consider homosexuality as a part of the constitutional affection that anybody has, whether men or women, well, actually as very young children, and was part of the discoveries about the sexuality of young children in terms of their affections for both their mothers and their fathers, and how that relates to their own sense of themselves and their body and their sexual instincts.
Although Martha had been disinterested in her husband's work, she became overly interested in Anna's patients and gossiped about them to the maids. She continued to plague Anna about her femininity, trying to influence her into high heels and makeup. When Martha became too feeble to care for herself, Sophie Dan became her nurse. Martha spoke to Sophie Dan of her ceaseless mourning for her daughter Sophie. As Martha lay dying, her last words were,
Sophie, Sophie.
Upon hearing of her mother's death, Anna wept openly. In the 1950s, the Anna Freud Foundation was set up in New York. Anna was invited to the United States to give a series of lectures and receive an honorary degree at Clark University, as her father had before her. Her mother would have been happy to know that the press wrote about Anna's blue silk suit and double strand of pearls. Anna visited with the Marshall Field Foundation, which was to be the funding source for the new Hempstead Clinic and Training Program. The clinic focused on researching mother-child analysis, the effect of the mother's neurosis on her children. Dorothy Burlingame supervised the indexing of cases and developed a psychological questionnaire.
Indexing as a research tool started with Anna Freud when she started a nursery for toddlers for children from the poorest parts of Vienna. And this was during the year just before she had to leave Vienna, in which everybody involved with the project would make observations about the children on index cards, and then they would file the observations in a system in a filing cabinet. Initially in Hampstead Clinic they had 60 children in analysis when they started the project, but literally accumulating hundreds and thousands of observations, all indexed according to the type of problem that the child had and the type of observations in different areas of research interest. So someone could literally go to a file cabinet and pull out 5 or 10 or 100 different observations on a particular topic.
Anna also founded a well baby clinic so that trainees could observe the behavior of children who were not disturbed. For a decade, Anna worked on creating a children's development profile based on her formulation of developmental pathology.
Well, developmental profile was the other research tool developed by the Hampstead Clinic by Anna Freud, and it was concordant with the indexing system. Anna Freud wanted to know if one could get underneath the surface of a child's problems to actually understand something about the nature of the child's interest even after the first few meetings. And she devoted a great deal of time and attention to how one could conduct the initial evaluation and all the different things one could consider to see if one could predict actually what the child's needs were, the areas of health, the areas of pathology, and also then to predict what kind of treatment the child would best respond to.
In the 1960s, Marilyn Monroe was treated by Anna's childhood friend, Marianne Rye Chris, who had become an analyst. Even though Monroe fired Chris after being forcibly committed to a New York psychiatric institute, Monroe bequeathed a sizable legacy to Chris in her will, stating that the funds be used for deprived children. The monies were forwarded to Anna for the clinic. In the 1970s, Anna co-authored a series of books dealing with legal and psychological questions of child custody. The works attacked the idea of joint custody and the inviolable rights of biological parents, and became a manual for lawyers, judges, and caseworkers whose personal experiences and rescue fantasies might bias their judgment.
Well, so through Anna Freud's teaching and visiting at the Yale Law School, she and Professor Goldstein of the Yale Law School and Solon, the pediatrician, began to correspond in their project to write The Best Interest of the Child. And then they got together in Ireland to actually write the book. And it was truly groundbreaking in the way that it advocated for considering the child's primary attachment and actually determining who it was that the child was attached to as their primary parent, whether that person be the mother, the father, the grandparent, or whoever, and trying to protect that relationship, which was so vital for the child's psychological health and good feeling and their sense of safety and protection, and orienting child visitation and custody around whatever was necessary to promote that relationship. Is very different than regarding the child as chattel property of parents, or looking at it in terms of parents' rights to actually put the child's attachment and their emotional needs before all else.
When feminists began dissecting and denigrating Sigmund Freud's theories on sexuality, most notably penis envy, Anna defended her father and felt that feminists were misinterpreting his ideas. Anna was very protective of her father's legacy and reputation and put many restrictions on his papers, letters, and publications. Some are not available for viewing until the middle of the 21st century. In keeping with the times, the training at Hampstead Clinic was focusing on eating disorders, drug addiction, sadomasochism, learning disturbances, promiscuity, guilt, and shame. In 1979, the clinic established the Hampstead Symposium, an annual congress in which child psychoanalysts and adult psychoanalysts could learn from each other. Although Dorothy had experienced chronic health problems for over a year, she attended all the meetings. At the conclusion of the symposium, Dorothy became bedridden. Dorothy Burlingame died in bed, age 88, with Anna sitting at her side. Her ashes were placed in the Freud family crypt. By all accounts, Anna and Dorothy were never sexual partners. Dorothy's son Michael told Anna,
"You were everything to her, and she had a most wonderful life with you. I keep thinking of all the happy times you had with each other, day after day after day."
The following year, at the second Hampstead Symposium, Anna's childhood friend Marianne Rye Chris died in Anna's guest room. 2 years later, Anna herself suffered a stroke that left her speech and motor functions impaired. She fretted over tremors in her hand and the myth of ripe old age. On October 9th, 1982, Anna Freud died in her sleep.